very, very interesting childhood. I was raised in a family which was loaded with inventors, scientists, and doctors. So we were always trained to ask questions and don't believe anything unless you tried it yourself. So it made it very interesting as a young kid in school, because I asked way too many questions and the teachers felt that I was being obnoxious or some other word that they would have for it. But I wanted to know the background. I didn't care the answer. How did you come up with the answer? And then I could decide for myself if it was a good answer or a bad answer. And that raised a lot of problems as a young kid in school. So I was asked to leave numerous schools and finally went to a private school in New Hampshire, where a very small number of students, there were only 7 of us in several of the classes, but they were all people of similar mindset that asked a lot of questions. And they didn't object to that. So it was very interesting to finally find an education system that worked for me, because I wanted to know the background. You know, why is this? Are you telling me this? Don't just tell me. Tell me why. Why is it happening? So I've always been on the inventor side, improving things and coming up with new ideas. And many of them I should have gathered up early in the 60s, and I probably would have been a very wealthy man now. You know, here these pods to do coffee. I asked why we didn't put coffee grinds in a tea bag, you know. Everybody said, no, you don't do that. This was in the early 60s. I go, okay, that worked out well. Very small school. All 4 grades amounted to, I think it was less than 100 kids. But they were all, I mean, some of the people you would recognize their families. Stewie Richardson was in my class, whose father was Vicks Corporation. And Ben Farrellis, his father was president of U.S. Steel and grandfather was chairman of the board. There were a lot of very interesting kids in that class that came from families that were very unusual in the industry and real pioneers. The thing that was beautiful about Proctor was it was small and it was very hands-on. They had a machine shop there at Proctor where we rebuilt cars and we built all sorts of stuff. We also had a wood shop that Alan Shepard spent one summer there and actually built a boat there. We actually did boat building. It was a lot of hands-on. Not like a lot of schools that were, and that's what Wentworth was so good about. For every hour in the classroom, we had 2 to 4 hours in the lab. So they would teach you something and then actually make you go experience it, rather than just trying to understand what the book was saying. So we had everything from metallurgy labs where we did stress of metals. We had welding labs. We had power generation. The school actually produced all its own power. It had the first nuclear reactor in Boston was on our campus, where they actually taught power generation. It was another thing. And also they worked with the Navy on teaching the subcorps guys how to work with a nuclear reactor. So it was a very advanced school, but a lot of the professors were multimillionaires who had retired from industry. So it was another hands-on application. It wasn't like a lot of the schools where it's all theory, but you've never experienced it. And you just assume that the guy's telling you the right story. And Wentworth was very much, and it's changed too, sadly. They had some deans that came in and kind of changed more toward the business aspects, which I feel was a really bad mistake, because I've never missed a day in work in my life because of the vast background that I have. Whereas a lot of these other people, when they lose their job, they're in trouble. I mean, there's so many different facets I could go to work in. And, you know, there's a great demand for them and it pays well. I mean, I've never had an issue on trying to make money. That's not a problem. I actually went into mechanical design. I was what they call an MD major. And what it enabled me to do was to understand, when I look at a machine, to immediately grasp what the original designer was thinking. And then I can look at the shortcomings and how I'm going to correct it. why something moves, how it moves, how you're controlling it and everything else. So the mechanical MD was right up my alley. And then they had MDE, which was the engineering, where they didn't really do as much hands-on as we did. We actually spent a great amount of time in learning how to run all the CNC machines and the lathes and the milling machines and the shapers and everything else. So we could go out and actually make the part. And then we could, first of all, design it, cast it in the foundry, carry it up to the machine shop and actually build the end product. So now we knew everything in between and how to change the design to make it better for production, because we'd gone through a few mistakes and it's like, whoa, if we did it this way, which wouldn't harm it, it'd be much faster and easier to machine. So you learn hands-on a much more efficient way to do things, whereas in the book, you can design something nobody could build, because there's no way you could ever machine it, much less actually, create it. But it looks good on paper, but it's a total disaster when it comes to reality. The family I was adopted into, we've had numerous family companies: Syracuse China, Passon Seymour Electric, and then on the other side, and Uncle Jim was head chemist for Procter & Gamble. He developed Tide, and then we've had a lot of other products that were developed. The modern ailerons were done by my grandfather, and then the other grandfather had a huge lumber business in Chicago. So it was a very interesting group of people, and it was kind of raised in benign neglect, we call it. You let you put your hand on the stove and figure out that it's hot and you don't want to do it again. They wouldn't lecture you, and they go, "You learned something?" Sure did. Don't want to do that again. But it was a very interesting upbringing, and I feel that it fit me very well, because otherwise it would have stifled me. Taking a washing machine apart and making a go-kart out of it. We even used the rollers and figured out how to steer them, because we didn't have wheels. And his grandfather was rather baffled how we could make the rollers go around the corner, but when he finally learned the design I'd come up with, he was pretty shocked that it worked. But then I was always into the engines. I would find a neighbor's lawnmower in the trash and bring it home and tear it down and rebuild it and make it work and sell it for some money, or put it to use and make money with it. Then I had a neat little business. I hired all the neighbor kids to help plow snow in upstate New York for all the doctors. We had a large number of doctors in the neighborhood, and they all had to be dug out twice a day, in the morning and the night when they came home. So I had all these little kids making money for me. On a good night, back in the late 50s and early 60s, I was making $2,000 to $3,000 a night moving snow. My father was shocked. He came in and see all the money stacked up on the table. I was paying these kids to run. I was going out and buying new snow blowers, and here I was like 12 years old, and the dealer would tell me how much it was, and I'd pull out $100 bills and buy it, and he's shocked. But I had all the equipment working. I mean, I've always been in the business end, figuring out how to make a dollar at it. Everything I look at, I can see how to tweak it. Then I learned very early on, the art of welding. I've done amazing projects in welding. And then when I went to college, I was trained as a machinist and a certified welder and all those, so I could build what I wanted. And that's helped us in the race world, because a lot of things that we had fail on the boats, I realized, first of all, weren't designed right, or they weren't built heavy enough. And then I would take like the whole gimbal system apart, go in and beef it up, change out, build my own bearings for it and put it in. We never had any more problems. And where other guys would lose a drive, I never had that problem. And we were running way more horsepower to the drives than they were, but we never had a failure. And it was a matter of understanding, don't take what they sell you, build it bigger and better and stronger, and understanding the mechanics. I knew a lot. I studied heavily in metallurgy, did a lot in that, so I understood what materials to use. And I've always just been, tweaking and improving. I know when we were on stage in Sarasota with the still team one time when we won in Sarasota, the older father came to me and he says, "You guys are very fortunate, because when you break something, you're able to go ahead and look at it and make a better part, so next time it doesn't fail." He said, "We don't have that in-house, so we have to buy another part and hope it doesn't fail." He said, "You guys have an unfair advantage on understanding, the mechanics of it and how to actually build something that'll take the racing stress. After college, I went down to the Caribbean. I was working in the Caribbean. Had a friend who's was vice president of Kodak, and they were building a house, and he had me go down and give a little hand there on some of the stuff that was happening. And then I got involved because I was watching a group of natives try to get one of the ferries running for the next day, and after several minutes of watching, I realized they had no idea what they were doing. And so finally I asked them, I said, do you really want to get it fixed, or you want to just play with it? And so they said, no, we need to get it fixed. So I jumped in and sorted it out for them and explained to them where they were making their errors. So then ultimately I moved down in the Caribbean. I spent a bunch of years down there building homes and doing all sorts of crazy things down there, doing a lot of underwater casting of cement on docks and all sorts of stuff nobody had done down there. And did a lot of work on some high-end boat owners that would come down with their mega yachts, and they would have a problem, so they'd get me out and I'd have to go out and sort it out for them. And had a lot of friends, did a lot of work on some huge sailboats, 140, 160 foot sailboats. And they would fly me all the way down to St. Lucia and put me up for a month or more and repair everything in the house and their vehicles and on their boats, and then they'd send me home. So I had a good time in the Caribbean, did a lot of work, built the wife and I got her involved in taking a LCM-8, one of the Navy crafts we bought from the Navy, converted it into civilian use and got it approved for open ocean and cargo and passengers, which is the first time that's ever been done. It was all a matter of balance. I've done a lot of work with the Navy and the Coast Guard and weights and balances on the boats. And it was a matter of slipping it through the cracks and figuring out how to make it, get the weight right and everything. And so that boat's still running down there. Did a lot of work on the ferry, started a ferry company, helped Gourley Ventures get going originally. And did a lot of stuff down there, and then built my own house off-grid. They were all talking of green. I was green, way back when. I mean, we had a big 2 kW windmill and a big solar farm, and we lived very nicely. Back when I was in Prudhoe Bay, we had heard about a gentleman in Grand Junction, Colorado, who was running an engine on water. Originally running a tractor on it, and then he was running a Chevy Blazer. And he showed Tommy the cell he had built. It was a form of electrolysis that we feel that he was using. You had other people who had been using high frequencies to shatter water and create products to run engines on. So we agreed to buy a cell, and 8 weeks later we went back. Tommy went back, and the guy's shop was empty and nobody acknowledged the guy had ever been there, which I thought was rather interesting. He just flat vanished, and everybody just, when you asked about the gentleman in the shop there, everybody just walked away and nobody would talk. So I decided to play on my own at that point. This was in the early 70s, 1974. So we had some very interesting adventures at the beginning on designing of the cell that I'm using now. In the preliminary, we played with the gases that we were producing, and then I kept working at it and then realized that electrolysis wasn't the answer. It takes far too much energy to take water apart, and it's the wrong gas. And then I realized there were actually 7 different gases that can be made from water. I went back and very much, like the Wright brothers, when they had listened to enough bogus information and weren't getting anywhere, they isolated themselves and proved everything to themselves. And that's why they still have the most effective propeller ever built. It was more than 97% efficient. But they spent a tremendous amount of time in their own little wind tunnel, carving and changing the shape and working on it. And even the current props today are not as effective as what they had built. That's what helped them fly, was to be able to get the horsepower to the air to get the aircraft to fly. And everyone's designs were wrong, and they'd heard enough BS and decided to build their own wind tunnel and start at the beginning. And that's what I did. So I came up with numerous designs, and we played with different gases. And then I realized when later we went back and looked at Faraday, who had done the initial electrolysis, that he was very frustrated because if he changed temperatures, changed solutions, the electrolytes, and changed things, the gas was different, but he couldn't prove what they were. He knew they were different because they burned different and things happened, and some of the gases were very unstable, others were a little bit more stable, and he couldn't figure out why it was happening. Well, he didn't realize he was creating a cocktail of 7 different gases. And I isolated the one gas of the 7 that I wanted to produce, which is a dioxytetrahydride. It's a DiTetra gas. What it is 2 oxygens bonded together with 4 hydrogens. But to make it stable, you have to add electrons to the hydrogens, which then flew in the face of science. But we knew we were doing it because we had done our own testing with hydrogen fuel cells. And we could more than double the output of the hydrogen fuel cell on the hydrogen when we separated it from our gas, which was a bonded oxygen hydro mix. And it also had stability and compressibility, which none of the other gases had. And so we knew we were onto something, and then it became, what do we do with it? And so then I decided the easiest way to possibly transport it was to reinfuse this gas, which is a form of water, it's the 5th phase of water, back into water and see if it would stay. And it took a considerable amount of time to develop the technology to test it and measure it and prove that it's there. And then we met the Russians that came over that had the GVD cameras, which is a gas visual discharge camera. And they'd been sampling water from all over the world with it because this was a technology that started in the early 1800s, but was finally completed in 2005 after Tesla and the modern computer had been built. And they were completely blown away because they've never seen a water like what we were creating with the gas infusion. So one of the first customers was my wife. We call her Mikey at that point. Let Mikey try it and see what happens. So we both tried the water. And I said, I want you to drink it for several weeks and make a list of what you notice, but don't tell me, and I'll make a list. And it was almost identical. And we then started handing it out to friends and family and attorneys we knew and other people. And they immediately said, you got to keep making this stuff. This stuff's incredible. So that was the beginning of that. But back in the 70s, we played with it on engines and started seeing the changes. And so we realized there was a lot of avenues we could go into, but the oil companies don't always play well. And so we didn't want to try to flip that big an apple cart to begin with. So we realized that for human benefit right now, it was better for us to go into the medical side and produce water that's being used in the medical industries and for healing and all sorts of things. And it all makes sense. I've got some physical chemists that are some of the best in the world that are working with us. And we have a pretty good understanding of why it's doing what it's doing now. And so it's not as much trial and error. We pretty much understand the structure, its ability to donate electrons. We can also make the oxygens donate protons. So when we do a lot of brain healing, it takes both. And we've had tremendous successes with the doctors and the medical community we're working with on helping people to heal. I mean, it's not the water healing, but it's providing the energy and the resources the body needs to heal itself, which is very different than putting in something artificial the body's going to fight. The body recognizes this water and what it can do because it helps with the communication from cell to cell, which is something I talked about for 30 years and nobody would listen to me. Now everyone's talking about it. But the cells in the body have to communicate. Otherwise, how do they know what to do? I mean, you cut yourself, how does it know to heal? I mean, otherwise the cut would remain open forever. But we've learned a lot, and we keep learning more all the time from the work we're doing. It was after we started handing it out. We started handing it out to friends and family, and then they all said, no, you got to keep making this stuff. And that's when the business of Watt-Ahh actually started. But then we kept working with the gas in other arenas because it will burn. It's not Brown's gas, it's a completely different flame. Its characteristics are very different. Brown's gas is slightly compressible. Yul Brown, who had actually stolen all the info from Rhodes, who stole it from the Germans, was only stable up to, at best, 150 psi, and then it would go off like a grenade. We've been able to compress our gas over 3,000 pounds and keep it for indefinitely, and it's not an issue. The thing is, nothing's bonded. See, what we're doing is we're providing additional electrons, and by providing electrons is what the human body runs on. Every plant, animal, anything that moves on the planet is burning electrons. Every time you pick your hand up and move it, think, every thought, every image your eyes are creating is burning electrons. That's why in your cameras, your sound is burning the batteries. That's electron use. Everything is electrons. And the Krebs cycle actually harvests electrons from hydrogen. And what we saw was that by doubling the electrons on hydrogen, which flew in the face of science, it only took about 5 years of work to prove to Harvard and MIT. That was through the help of Dr. Peterson, who actually funds the MIT labs. He had us go and show them that hydrogen can carry more than one electron. So now it's finally become accepted. But we've done a lot of things showing it can carry actually far more than the second electron. But that's for other projects we're working with. But it's a lot of, in the world of chemistry, like a lot of things I've run into, people believe something that was said in the 1800s. And no one's bothered to actually pull it apart and say, wait a minute, is this really real, or has this just been repeated 10 million times and now everybody accepts it as fact? And that's where I think there's a lot of things in the world that if people are willing to put the time and the effort, we'll find a lot of things that they think are correct are not correct. And the world was flat for many years. And then they finally was proven, you were a heretic if you said it wasn't flat. People were executed over it. And now, they've finally proven the world's not flat. You're not going to fall off the edge. But if it's repeated enough times, people believe it. We put together a small group and we were trying to come up with a name. Aquanu is what Dana and I came up with as the base company, but we were looking for a name for the product. And we had a gentleman who was from New England, and they pronounced water as Watt-Ahh. So it hit us all in a good way. To me, it's watts and amps. But to them, it's the way they pronounce it in New England. It was Watt-Ahh. So that's why we got jumped on there, and we were able to capture the name. But to me, it was Aquanu, because this is a new form of water. It's a different structural formulation of hydrogen and oxygen, which is extremely stable and very beneficial to the plants and the animals in the body. But that's how the name Watt-Ahh came about. It was one of the New England boys was sitting there, opened his mouth, and it fell out, and everybody jumped on it and says, yeah, perfect name, perfect name. So everybody went for it. Our water hydrates more than 4 times more than any water that we've seen on the planet. Boat racing, especially in the canopy boats, is brutal because the guys are dehydrated. We've done work with the special ops guys. We've got medical clinics for the special ops guys that use the water to help everything from PTSD to dehydration issues and other issues. Especially toxins we're very good at. A lot of it was the paramedics, because we've done other events here in Sarasota where there's a lot of people passing out from heat and alcohol. And the paramedics were, I mean, my God, they were taking just piles of our water because people were having a few too many beers in the sun and dehydration and setting in and having issues. And then, so we became quite good friends with the racing community because they realized that key for racing, or any sport for that matter, is hydration. And it seems to be missed even by the professional teams. When you call up one of the major, baseball teams or football teams and ask, who's your hydration coach, they go, what are you talking about? And I'm kind of shocked because it only takes a 2% dehydration of the human and he's basically useless. And it's like, really, you're playing in Florida in the heat here and you don't understand the most important thing you have on your players is hydration? And then they have kids that drop dead out there on the football fields because the coach is being a hard one, making them suffer. It's like, no, I mean, you don't understand what you're doing here. If you want to get them to perform better, you provide hydration. And so that was kind of the motivation initially, but it ultimately, ended up in a different arena. But we did meet a lot of great people. I'm not complaining about that at all. But it's just, the racing has been a good venue. We are seeing more professional sports people using the water now. Some I can't give the names, that are some pretty big players. We've set some new world records because of the water on athletes. We now have skydivers that are jumping at 22,000 feet without oxygen, which is impossible. You can't survive at 22,000 feet without oxygen. But our guys are doing fine. Their blood oxygen is 100% and they're having a ball because they're not carrying an oxygen tank and a regulator and a face mask and everything else to jump from. They're jumping basically naked as a jerrybird other than a bottle of Watt-Ahh strapped to their chest with a sippy straw. And so we learned that from some of our jet pilots that were flying 3 hours on a liter of water not using oxygen. So then we had some of the mountain climbers go to the highest peak in Europe, which is in Russia. And the average time to climb from base camp to the peak is over 12 hours without oxygen. We had a gentleman go from Miami to the mountain in Russia, and the next day, without even acclimating at base camp, they told him it would take 2 weeks to a month to acclimate to be able to climb. The next day, he grabbed the Sherpa and took off, and he had 2 bottles of Watt-Ahh. He made the peak and back in 5 hours and 1 minute. Or 6 hours, pardon me, 6 hours and 1 minute. He cut it in half. He wanted to do it in under 6 hours, but he said if the Sherpa had been on the water, he said we probably could have done it in 5, because I had to keep waiting for the Sherpa to catch up to me. And here's a man that flew in the previous day from Miami at sea level and then climbs the highest peak in Europe. We went to Lucy on the boat racing here in Sarasota because we live here and boat racing's been up my alley. And we asked about having a booth down with all the other vendors. And Lucy told us we couldn't do that because Miller Brewing had the rights for the liquids at the thing. But Lucy said, well, there's a way around that. She said, if you become part of a race team, you can have your own booth and nobody can say anything. So Dana jumped on that. So the racing goes to my lovely wife, Dana, getting us involved. So she said she had a team that needed help, and it was the National Guard team at that time. And she said, they're nice guys, but they need a lot of help. So we got involved, and within 2 weeks, the boat suddenly lived at my place. And in the first year, I think we took second in the Worlds. The second year, we dominated the Worlds in P3, which is unheard of. So we suddenly I started to use my connections and my knowledge to help get the boat in the position where it's performing the way it should perform. And so that's how we ended up getting into racing, and then that boat we sold. And then we moved into the bigger boat now, the Cat we have, which is a Spectra, which is designed and built by Jay Panini here in Sarasota, which is an incredible boat. propeller designs are still something that computers can't do. They can get semi-close, but there's so many variables that a computer, there's not enough points you could plug in a computer because each engine is different, where it develops its horses, where the torque comes in, where the horsepower is, what the course is. Is it a race one through acceleration, or is it a race one on top end? There's so many variables that's why, you know, it's best to, you know, a lot of it is trial and error. And, you know, I worked with some of the guys in Louisiana when they first came out with the big Arneson surface drives. And they went through absolute, you know, nightmares fighting to come out what the propeller should look like. Because the computers were designing propellers that did not perform. And finally they brought in some of the old boys that had been building props all their lives that were 60, 70 years old and said, no, this is what we'll do. And they built the props, and holy crow, it worked phenomenal. And the computer guys were all baffled. Well, that prop will never work, and it worked phenomenal because there's just too many variables. And a lot of it is trial and error in racing as to what works and what doesn't work. There's a lot to it. I mean, you've got to understand the flow of fluids, how the fluid moves. You've got to understand, you know, the differences between a 3-blade, a 4-blade, and a 5-blade, and a 6-blade propeller. Each has its own little niche that it'll work in. But whether or not you're going to fit into that niche with your boat is another game. The fewer the blades, the more torque you can get to the water because the blade's bigger and stronger. The more blades you have, the more flexible the blades are. Now you start to lose the bite, and then also you've compounded the friction errors. So you've got to really understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. And, you know, one boat will run fine on one prop and put it on another boat, and the boat's a dog. Been in the racing industry, car racing and boat racing for many, many years. No, a lot of them, you know, believe what they've been told, and they're not open to new things. And you have to basically go out and beat them bad repeatedly, and then they'll finally start to come over and look at what you're doing. Because initially, you know, they don't understand. It's like in boat or car racing, you know, it's a matter of how do you get the horsepower to the ground. Building the horsepower is one thing, but how do you get it to the ground? You can come out with slicks on a wet day and it's not going to work well for you. But you run a wet tire on a dry pavement, it doesn't work well either. And same in boats. How do you get the horsepower to the water? You can blow a rooster tail that'll cover a 12-story building, but it's not moving the boat very well. So, I mean, it's a matter of how do you get it to work for what you're trying to do, and that takes a different mindset. I mean, we used to watch all the time the guys in idling out there on the course before the race, and the batteries would go dead. And the problem was that idle, the alternators weren't putting out enough juice to keep the batteries up. But the guys were worried that at high RPM they'd explode the alternator. But nobody had done the math to find the right size pulley. But idle is still charging enough to keep everything up, but at high end you weren't unwinding the alternator. So, I mean, I've tried to talk to a couple of the teams in Key West, and every day they go out and after idling for an extended time, they're dead at the start. My uncle was head of Watkins Glen, and I worked at a Chevy dealer, Mallier Chevrolet, when I was young, and I did a lot of custom welding of headers and stuff for the guys. And Johnny Brereton, who was the owner, he held, you know, numerous records in drag racing at the Grand Nationals. And so I've been around engines all my life. And then when I was young, I had a Chris Craft, which stuffed a 365 horse 327 in and pulled out the little gray marine engine. And we had one of the few boats the guys could barefoot water ski at 60 miles an hour behind it. So engines have always been kind of my nature. A lot in the drag racing world, we did a lot of work. Then in college, I made a lot of money on drag racing because I took care of 4 Corvettes and a GTO on Commonwealth Ave. And we used to have races, and the policeman that took care of Denny's would hold the money. because it was one of the few places there weren't any side streets. So we'd race all the way from where we were up to the BU Bridge, and there was nobody could come in on you. And so after midnight, we had a great number of races that took place down there. And the policeman made good money, and we paid him well. And I ran the second biggest Gulf station in Boston at that point because we became quite successful. But engines in racing have always been, right up my alley, whether it was boat racing, car racing. And then we knew one of the co-drivers for Robbie Gordon. His name is Gar Roberts. He does the Baja runs with him. And then when I explained to him that we could improve fuel to get far more horsepower and torque and drop the emissions dramatically and drop the internal temps in the engine, but yet build way more horses, he kind of thought I was full of BS. So I was asked to come up to North Carolina and do some dyno testing for them. And I'd already done dyno testing on the diesels, and we actually had a couple of the engines walk through the dyno where they couldn't hold the horsepower down. And they were completely baffled, and the internal temps dropped, but yet the horsepower went right off the charts, and they were able to actually walk through the dyno, which they'd never been able to do. And so we had them set up a car for us. I went up and we took a machine up. We've got all the computer data off the dyno on that, and the best that they had seen in 25 years of work was 4 horsepower. And then the emissions went south on them. The first run we did of infusing the gas into the fuel was 50 horse gain. And I told them it's going to take a little while because they use a fuel bladder like we do in the boats. And it's a sponge inside of the tank, basically, a sponge foam, where it takes a while for the new fuel to finally permeate to where it gets to the pickup. Second run, we gained 100 horse. This is a 400 horse motor now. Third run, we were 150 horses up. And fourth run, we were over 160 horses up. And then we were over 160 foot-pounds more torque. And at 6,000 RPM, we had no horsepower loss. It was still on a straight-up shot. And they were beside themselves. And the throttle response was instantaneous. As soon as the driver hit the foot to the floor, he had already hit the rev limiter. That's how fast it was turning up on the dyno. And virtually vibration-free, no odor of the race fuel, which has a very pungent smell. That was gone. We had an oxygen-positive exhaust, no NOx, no CO, all CO2 and water was basically the byproducts. And that completely baffled them. And I explained to them, I said, this is just the beginning, because what I wanted to show them was fuel A to fuel B. I didn't want to change the timing of the engine. I didn't want to change air-fuel ratios. I didn't want to modify the motor, because now it's not apples to apples. You've got an apple and an orange or something else you've created. And I said to them that we can get even more horses if we start playing with the timing, we start playing with the fuel-air ratios of what we're doing. But they were completely beside themselves, because the exhaust you could actually breathe and it wouldn't have killed you. And the engine was far smoother. It was like almost like driving a steam engine, because we had a bottle sitting on the dyno next to the race car, and there wasn't a ripple on the top at 6,000 RPM. And what we've seen is that we're actually able to turn the engines up, bump the rev limiter up at least 1,000 or sometimes 2,000 RPM, and the engine's fine. It's just smooth as silk. One of the guys wants to do he has a rat rod that holds the land speed record right now. And he's asked about getting our fuel, because they don't care what you run for fuel. They're just looking at speed. And we'll probably help him, because he'll be able to turn up higher RPM, and he's getting full horses at that RPM, whereas before he was losing horses. But what we're seeing is, emissions-wise, one of the comments that came from the group up there was that you finally showed us an internal combustion engine that's putting out less emissions than basic electric car. Because the electric car is charged by coal right now. Most of the coal plants are charging these things. unless you have your own solar array. And then what do you do with a toxic battery? Nobody recycles these lithium-ion batteries, so what are we going to do? We're going to bury them in, somebody's backyard? The internal combustion engine can burn clean enough to where it's not an issue. And I hate to be this tough on some of these environmental people, but carbon is not a greenhouse gas. Carbon does not hold heat, much less regenerate heat. Hydrogen is the one that's why they can't ever predict the weather correctly. It's whether you have cloud cover, because the clouds will suck up massive amounts of heat coming in from the sun and not let it come to the earth. When the clouds go away, all of a sudden the temp goes way up. It's not carbon. Carbon is not a greenhouse emissions problem. The plants use CO2. CO is an issue because that's partially burned fuel. But there is a technology that we can show to burn these fossil fuels cleanly. And it's not going to, also we save fuel because we're getting far more horsepower for a given amount of fuel. When we gained the 160 horses, we were almost 30% less fuel. There's using a lot especially in NASCAR and whatnot. I've had a little experience in there, and some of the people I've met recently. A lot of it's done with telemetry of the car. There's all sorts of data being crunched, and there's still room there. You still have the human factor, which the computer can't deal with. And there's ways that I think that there's still plenty of improvement to come. One of the areas that I went up and demonstrated here recently was in the fuels. Our fuels and the way the engine's using the fuel is extremely wrong. And I went up and actually demonstrated up in North Carolina, and we showed how we could take the fuel and generate more than 60% more horsepower. Versus the emissions were no CO, oxygen positive, no NOx, and just CO2 and water. And we gained, on a 400 horse motor, we gained over 160 more horses. And the engine was able to function at 6,000 RPM and still be on a straight line curve going up for more horsepower. And the mid-range we gained, it was almost 150, 160 more horses. So it changed how you actually had to drive the car, because we had a couple of them to go out and play with it on the track, and they didn't heed the warnings that it was very similar to driving an electric car, that you can have full horsepower instantly. And we had some close calls right at the first couple corners because they didn't realize that here they're at mid-range, I'm talking 2,500, 3,000 RPM, they were actually well over the horsepower that they had at top RPM. So when the guy came into the corner and poked it hard, like he's used to, he suddenly found the tail leading the car down the road because the tires couldn't handle the horsepower. And he just lit it up and, and scared the bejesus out of himself. And he came in all hopping down, up and down, and you should have warned me more. And I said, well, we tried to explain to you that you got to learn to drive the engine now, because you've got way more torque and way more horsepower, and it's instantaneous horsepower. When you hit it, it's already there. It's not a matter of when you're drafting somebody and you're a foot behind them. You don't hit the throttle and then pull out. If you hit the throttle, you're going to be in his trunk somewhere. You pull out and then hit the throttle. Whereas before, the engine always took a couple, fractions of a second to actually start to spool up. Well, this, it's already happened. It's like, you don't want to be behind him and hit the gas because you already hit the guy. See, none of them would believed it. There's no way. We've been doing this for, I don't know, since when did Marmon start racing? They've been doing it since then and haven't experienced that, what the proper fuel in the engine can do. And also we're using 30% less fuel, and we dropped the internal temps in the motor. The exhaust temps dropped over 400 degrees, but yet we're developing considerably more horsepower. And there's about 4 technologies in what we've developed, which is the gas form, the DiTetra gas, which is infused into the water we make, the Watt-Ahh. But it also will infuse into fuel, oils. We're working on taking now these bottles, the PET1 plastic, and making clean burning diesel. We've already just patented that with a group I'm working with, and using the gas technology. What I demonstrated to them was on a carbureted engine, because I didn't want a computer changing parameters when we're running. The problem is, I explained to them what type of engine I wanted. I wanted a, Chevy with carbureted, and because nothing is changing. You can either run the engine, you can dial it up to run rich, you can, set the adjustments to run, lean. I didn't want the engine changing parameters. The problem is with the computer-driven engines, and we've demonstrated this time and time again, that if you take this augmented fuel and put it in a computer motor, it completely confuses the computer. Because the computer is driven with electronics which are looking at the oxygen content. Lambda, which is a pure burn, is 14.7. But you don't really want, with regular fuel, you don't want to go 14.7 because you're right at the verge of oxidation, and you'll normally burn a valve or burn a hole in the piston. So they run them down somewhere between 12.5 and 13, which means you're going to have natural emissions. What we're seeing is we actually come out with an oxygen positive, which means there's more oxygen in the exhaust now than what the engine started with. It's changing the structures, and then we come out with a water in the exhaust and an oxygen positive. So it's not bad for the environment. We need to keep the environment somewhere above 12% for humans to survive. We get down below 12%, we're going to have problems. We're not going to be able to make it. But I think we can do this and in a way that is not going to be highly expensive. Treating the fuel is not that expensive to do, and it's universal. But what the problem was, they wanted to go to the computer motors, and I said to them, what you're going to need to do is, I don't have the time right now. I mean, my problem is I've got way too many things on my table right now to take care of. I need to sit down with the guys on the dyno and start off with the basic engine form, but carbureted, where we can go ahead and play with it. We've got to then dial that in on air-fuel ratios. At certain RPMs, this is what the emissions look like. At higher RPM, this is what the emissions look like. And teach create all the data that we now can use an oxygen sensor in the exhaust, go to a computer motor, and say, at 1,000 RPMs, no load, this is what we see. And at 1,000 RPMs with a load on it, this is what we see. Teach the engine for the power curves, teach the engine so that the computer knows where to go with the fuel. Because what we've seen is, if we put our fuel in it, it sees a high oxygen content, which is telling the computer the engine's running too lean. So what it does is richens up the fuel. Well, when it does that, the oxygen level goes even higher. Now it goes, oh my goodness, we got to add more fuel. So after a very short period, the engine just can't burn the amount of fuel that's being pumped into it, because it's trying to get the oxygen level down. And so it's going to take probably a month's time working on a dyno to truly understand how to program a computer to run on this engine. It's like, you have dual fuel cars. The computer is looking at, are we running on regular gas or are we running on ethanol? Because the emissions are very different. I think we can definitely show that the engines become far more dependable because we're dropping the internal temperatures. And so we've had interest on not only the piston people, but some people that are working with turbines, that if we can drop the internal temps on the turbines, then you don't have to go to ceramic blades, which are $1,000 a piece or some staggering amount of money. And you've got a whole bunch of them in there. You've got a couple $100,000 worth of just blades. You can drop back down to titanium blades or something else because the temp's down. The problem is they can't handle the heat. Same in the engines, that what we're seeing is, in the auto industry, the beauty of it is you could go with a smaller motor that generates far more horsepower, but also is going to stay together and have the longevity. And it burns cleaner, so it means you need less oil changes, you're burning less fuel, and the emissions are something that are friendly. Goal is to license others to come in and partner with us, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. I mean, the uses for the gas itself are limitless. I mean, every day we find new avenues that it could definitely improve products on the market, or definitely be world-changing in what they're doing. But right now, being small, financially limited, we don't have unlimited resources. We've been concentrating on the health and the water company. Hopefully here we'll get to a position with that where we'll have some assistance, because we're getting requests now from foreign countries to build water plants over there for their people, because right now they're importing water from here, which is extremely expensive. So we've had numerous groups come to us that want us to partner with them. And that's more of the arena that I think we want to get into, because we're just a small company. We've only got Dan and I full-time, and then we've got several part-time employees. And so ideally what we'll do is licensing, eventually, this plastic business will be sold, licensed to somebody to make, because we can produce for a very reasonable price. We can take all the plastic that they want to get rid of for free, and we can produce a clean burning diesel, because it's carrying additional electrons, and it's also carrying the water gas in it, which changes how the fuel burns, and it burns more efficiently and whatnot. So it's good for utilizing the product, which is an oil-based product, but being able to burn it cleanly and utilize it rather than just parking it in a landfill for 100 years. Doesn't make any sense. And the cost of producing it is extremely low compared to a gallon of diesel. So it's going to work there. And what we're doing is coming up with a way to utilize the fuel in a more efficient manner. If you take it and you basically release it into the atmosphere as CO2, that's what the plants are looking for. If you release it as CO, and the CO molecule, that's another one that I think is a little misunderstood. It's basically two of them bonded together. And that's why it's so difficult to get it out of somebody who has CO poisoning. We've been able to work on that side, but I think a lot of it is a misnomer. And I think a lot of it is, I won't say it's all politically driven, but a lot of it is, there's a lot of holes in their fallacies, let's put it that way.